The only saving grace here, frankly, is that we are weeks, perhaps even more, weeks away, not until May, I would imagine, with the Israelis mount such an operation. And today, even as we speak, two senior members of Mr. Netanyahu's government have been talking virtually with Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and other administration officials. This was the much delayed ballyhooed visit that was supposed to take place last week, canceled as a consequence of the American abstention on the UN Security Council resolution by the Prime Minister. But those conversations took place today. I suspect they'll be ongoing because the administration, understandable, I suspect, has real concerns about whether or not the Israelis can do what they need to do in Rafah without endangering hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
So maybe there is the opportunity for the U.S. to express those views, to provide suggestions, if they have, as they have said they will, for alternatives to how the operation in Rafah could be handled. But it's still the remaining question is whether or not the Israelis are hearing that message, whether they're giving much credence at all to whatever the U.S. has to say.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. The other interceding development, of course, could be an agreement. Negotiators are now in Qatar. Israelis, Egyptians, Qataris, Americans, to try to broker a limited exchange, hostages for Palestinian prisoners, and a temporary, let's call it a temporary ceasefire for 6 weeks. That might actually create a situation where you could break the battlefield dynamic. But again, Mr. Netanyahu has said so many times that they've got to do Rafah, quote unquote, do Rafah. Israeli public, including the war cabinet, Benny Gantz, who is the putative successor, if you believe the polls, and I do, should elections be held today or even 3 months from now, Netanyahu would not be able to put together a government. But the vast majority of the Israeli public is still very much supportive, not of Netanyahu, but of his war aims.
Well, and of course, we saw the Israeli public, or at least tens of thousands of members of the Israeli public out over the weekend protesting, calling for new elections. And I just wonder to what extent you think that domestic pressure would actually change the behavior of Bibi Netanyahu, knowing there also was great pressure and a long period of protest over the judicial reform that he was trying to push through. And it took a long time for that actually to turn into changes in those proposals. What influence, if any, do those protesters have?
No, I'm glad you referred to the mass protests in a country of nearly 10 million people, hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets, 40 plus weeks in a row. I'm wondering, frankly, whether or not on any issue we would be capable of doing something quite like that. But it stalled the judicial reform. It prevented Netanyahu from acting. And I think mass public opinion and demonstrations is now the new force in Israeli politics. The problem is there's no mechanism right now to topple this Israeli government. If there aren't defections from Mr. Netanyahu's coalition, and they probably won't be, there's no way to call for new elections. And the notion of a constructive vote of no confidence, where the parties would identify a ministerial candidate that got more than 60 plus one votes, that could create a new government without elections, that's almost impossible. And Benjamin Netanyahu, on trial for bribery, fraud, breach of trust, is not going to resign. So I think right now there's no mechanism to remove him. I think if this war downshifts, then I think the issue of accounting and accountability will come to the fore. And it strikes me as almost impossible to imagine that a prime minister who's presided over the worst terror attack in the history of the state of Israel, the bloodiest day for Jews since the Nazi Holocaust, is going to be able to survive. Every poll suggests he can't and won't.
Meantime, we're still getting fresh news out of the weekend, Aaron, and we want to be careful with this, as this is just reporting from Iranian and Syrian state media, but they are reporting today that an Israeli airstrike on Iran's embassy compound in Syria has killed a number of people, including a top military commander, Mohammad Reza Zahedi, a high-ranking Iranian general who had been linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Is that a major escalation in this conflict when we're talking about strikes in Syria against Iranians, keeping in mind that it hasn't just been Israel versus Hamas, but other Iranian proxies active in this region as well since October 7th?
Add to that the fact that the Israelis struck in December and killed a top IRGC commander. Reza Zahidi, though, I think it was even more senior than the one they killed last year. If you told me that 6 months into this war, what you have is a mini confrontation every single day between Hezbollah and Israelis along the Israeli-Lebanese border, that we wouldn't have had a major escalation, I wouldn't have believed you. Although Hezbollah and Israel and the Iranians have been operating under a kind of escalatory threshold, simply unwilling to take the kinds of steps that could trigger a major escalation. We talk about major escalation, we're talking about an Israeli-Hezbollah war, which in summer of 06, shut down the northern half of the Middle East's most preeminent military power, Israel. This time around, Hezbollah's got between 150,000 and 200,000 high trajectory weapons of various ranges, lethalities, and precision. You don't want to go there because you could easily, in that situation, morph into strikes by the U.S. and or Israel on Iranian territory, Iran's retaliation with ballistic missiles. Then you'd see something the Middle East has never experienced before, which is a major regional war. I don't think you're going to get there, but certainly the Israelis have not claimed responsibility for this. But this sort of escalation could, in fact, trigger an escalatory cycle. Hopefully it won't.
Well, and while we're considering other forces in the Middle East, and just our remaining minute here with you, over the weekend as well, we did get news out of Turkey. The party of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan suffering an unprecedented defeat in municipal elections. Just how consequential is what's happening in Turkey for the balance in the wider Middle East?
I'm not sure it has much of an impact yet, at least in the broader Middle East. I think it does have consequences for Erdogan, who's from Istanbul. He served as mayor. He considers it a major stronghold. The fact that one of his key opponents actually bested him by a significant number of votes doesn't augur well for his legacy, or perhaps for the policies that he wants to continue to push for internally in Turkey. So again, I'm not sure you're talking about a major regional consequence, but certainly for internal Turkish politics, very significant.